Hey everyone, welcome to today's special episode. I'm so glad you could join us. What we're about to dive into is a powerful story that takes us to the heart of one of history's most tumultuous times, but also shows the beauty of human connection even in the darkest moments. This isn't just another war story. It's a story of empathy, unexpected friendship, and the fragile spark of peace that can exist even in a world torn apart by conflict. We're going to take you through the journey of two groups of soldiers, once enemies, finding a way to set aside their differences and share in something deeper than the orders they were given or the guns they were handed. This story isn't just about the battles they fought. It's about the shared humanity that can rise up in the most unlikely of places. It's about what happens when, for one fleeting moment, peace becomes possible. So, get comfortable, relax, and let's step into a world where even in the worst of circumstances, we can find the light of kindness. As you listen, think about this. What would you do if faced with the choice to be more than just a soldier, to be human in the truest sense? It's a question that haunts everyone in this story. Are you ready? Then let's begin. The cold air of the trenches was thick with the smell of smoke and damp earth. Mud clung to the boots of the soldiers, and the constant churn of their surroundings made every step feel like a struggle. The war had ground on for what seemed like forever, and each day blurred into the next. There were moments of violence, moments of quiet, but most of it felt like a limbo, trapped between the two extremes. The sound of gunfire, the deafening roar of artillery, the screams, and then the silence that followed, the kind of silence that felt too heavy to bear. Christmas Eve was nearing, and in the midst of the endless waiting, the soldiers on both sides of the battlefield had started to feel something that could only be described as exhaustion, not just in their bodies, but in their souls. Sergeant Jenkins looked across the dark expanse of no man's land, where fires flickered dimly from the German trenches. His breath fogged in the air as he rubbed his hands together, desperate for warmth that never seemed to come. The wind howled, and the cold seeped into his very bones. He sighed, his gaze fixed on the faint glow across the way. "Feels like it's been forever, doesn't it, Harris?" Private Harris, his rifle resting in his lap, nodded slowly, eyes distant. "Forever and then some, Sarge," he replied, his voice barely audible over the wind. "You ever think about what Christmas used to be like? Back home, I mean." Jenkins' eyes softened as he turned away from the trench, gazing at the ground beneath him. "A lifetime ago, Harris," he said quietly. "A lifetime ago." His voice cracked slightly, but he quickly masked it, his face hardening once more. Across the battlefield, on the German side, it was much the same. The men were exhausted, their faces drawn and weary. The air was bitter, and the cold gnawed at their bones. Private Muller wiped his face, grimacing as his sleeve smeared more dirt and grime over his already filthy skin. His eyes were tired, haunted by days that felt like they would never end. "Christmas is just another day here, isn't it?" he muttered to his comrade, Beck, who sat nearby, trying to warm his hands on a small fire they had managed to light. Beck looked up at the cold sky, his breath forming clouds in the air. "Another day in hell," he muttered back. But there was a note of something else in his voice, something hesitant. "I don't know. There's something about tonight. I don't think I've ever been this far from home." His words hung in the air between them, the silence that followed somehow heavier than the usual quiet of the trenches. It was an uneasy silence, one that seemed to stretch across the desolate expanse of no man's land. The night was cold and still, with only the occasional crackle of firewood breaking the quiet. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath, waiting. The soldiers on both sides were isolated in their misery, yet there was something unspoken, something simmering beneath the surface, a shared sense of longing. Longing for home, longing for peace, longing for something, anything, to break the endless cycle of violence that had come to define their lives. And then, just as the air grew colder and the night seemed to settle deeper into its frozen grip, something unexpected happened. A sound. It started as a whisper, barely audible over the wind, but it quickly grew louder. At first, Mueller and Beck exchanged confused glances, unsure of what they were hearing. Then, as the sound grew clearer, it became undeniable, a melody, soft and comforting, drifting through the cold air. It was music, a song they knew well, a song that had been sung in homes and churches across the world. Stille Nacht, the Germans were singing. Sergeant Jenkins was the first to hear it, his eyes widening in surprise. He had been staring blankly at the opposite trench, his mind lost in thoughts of home, but the sudden strain of music pierced through his haze. His breath caught in his throat. "Harris, do you hear that?" Harris, his attention also snapped by the unexpected sound, tilted his head and listened carefully. For a moment, everything seemed to still. The distant hum of artillery, the rustling of soldiers shifting in the trenches, it all faded into the background. All that was left was the soft, haunting melody floating through the night air. A slow smile spread across Harris's face. "It's Silent Night, Sarge. They're singing." The men in the British trench stood frozen, listening intently. The song, which had been carried over from across no man's land, seemed to pierce the heavy air, a reminder of a world far removed from the brutal reality of war. For a few moments, no one moved. It was as though the song had cast some kind of spell over the men, binding them to the music, to the peace it evoked. Jenkins stood still for a moment longer, the tension in his chest loosening ever so slightly. It was almost too much to believe the enemy, the ones he had spent so many days fighting, now offering this small, beautiful gift. It was a thread of connection, so delicate yet so profound, that it seemed to transcend the boundaries of the battlefield, of nationality, of hate. He felt something stir deep inside him, something he hadn't felt in a long time, hope. Hope that perhaps, just perhaps, peace could exist even in the darkest corners of the world. Tentatively, Jenkins began to hum along, his voice soft and unsure at first, but it grew stronger as the song filled his chest. Soon, the other British soldiers joined in, their voices blending together, hesitant but growing bolder as they realized they were not alone in the melody. It was then that Harris, too, started to sing, his voice joining the rest. There was something almost sacred about it, something fragile and raw, as if the very act of singing this song in the midst of war was an act of defiance against the violence that had consumed their lives for so long. Across the way, Muller heard the British soldiers' voices rise to meet the Germans. He looked over at Beck, his face pale in the dim light. "They're singing with us," he whispered, almost in disbelief. Beck could hardly believe it himself. He had been in this war long enough to know that the chance of something like this happening was next to nothing. Yet here they were, both sides, united for a fleeting moment by the same song. Muller took a deep breath, and with a look to Beck, he started to sing louder. His voice, raw and cracked from days of yelling over gunfire, was joined by others. The song filled the air, each soldier on both sides singing together, a rare and precious moment of shared humanity amid the carnage. The words of Silent Night, simple and unadorned, rang out across the field, each note carrying with it a sense of fragile peace that the men had almost forgotten was possible. In that brief, magical moment, it seemed as if the war had stopped. The sound of gunfire was replaced by the sound of men singing, and the battlefield itself felt somehow transformed. The distant rumblings of war, the cries of the wounded, the clamor of boots in the mud, all of it seemed to fade away. For the first time in months, the soldiers on both sides felt something other than the weight of their rifles and the fear of what lay ahead. They felt something like hope, the Christmas spirit, that sense of unity and peace that had once seemed impossible, had found its way into the hearts of men who had long ago abandoned the idea of anything other than survival. It wasn't much, just a song, a fleeting moment, but in that instant, it was enough. The war, for a single night, had paused, and peace, however brief, had won. As the song drew to a close, the silence that followed felt different, softer, gentler. The men stood in the stillness, some with tears in their eyes, others simply staring out into the darkened night. And in that silence, the promise of something more, something better lingered in the air, carried on the fragile wings of a simple carol. In the heart of war, on the eve of Christmas, peace had momentarily prevailed. As the cold night stretched on, an eerie quiet settled over the battlefield. The distant sounds of artillery fire, the groans of the wind through the barren landscape, and the occasional rattle of loose debris filled the air, but for the moment, it seemed as though the world had paused. The soldiers, worn and haggard from months of unrelenting conflict, had grown accustomed to the rhythm of war, its violence, its chaos, its endless uncertainty. But tonight was different. There was something in the air, something faint, a flicker of light breaking through the otherwise oppressive darkness of the trenches. On the British side, as they often did when the fighting lulled, the men found small ways to cling to the traditions that had once made their lives seem more ordinary. Sergeant Jenkins, who had seen the worst of what this war could bring, stood by the edge of the trench, a small, weary smile tugging at the corners of his mouth as he began to work. With a rough hand, he draped a tattered piece of red cloth across a nearby post. It was threadbare, faded from years of use, but it was something that reminded them of the world beyond the trenches. Other soldiers joined in, pulling out their few decorations, items saved from care packages or sent from home. Wooden ornaments, chipped and worn, hung from the walls of the trench, the flickering light of nearby fires casting long, soft shadows. It was a small act, one that barely seemed to matter in the grand scheme of things, but it felt like home. The soldiers moved in a quiet reverence as they hung the decorations, some exchanging soft, tired smiles, as though these tiny gestures could somehow bring them closer to the lives they had once known, lives now distant and fading like the memories of peaceful times. Across the expanse of no man's land, the Germans were doing the same. Private Muller stood at the edge of the German trench, his eyes scanning the horizon. It was then that he noticed the faint glow of lights coming from the British side, the dim, flickering candlelight reflected on the cold, muddy ground. There, in the distance, he could make out the shape of a small tree, an oddity in a landscape that had been nothing but devastation. The branches were sparsely adorned with mismatched ornaments, some crude and others lovingly crafted, all crowned with a few flickering candles. It was a humble sight, but it carried with it a warmth that seemed out of place in the barren, war-torn world around them. Muller turned to his comrade Beck, who was leaning against the trench wall, his rifle beside him, his eyes heavy with exhaustion. "What's this?" Mueller asked, a half-laugh escaping his lips despite himself. "A Christmas tree?" Beck looked over, his eyes narrowing in the cold night air. He shrugged, but there was something different in his gaze, a glimmer of something that hadn't been there before. Maybe it's a sign that we're not all so different after all," Beck said quietly, his voice thoughtful. Mueller nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the distant lights from across the field. He stood there for a moment, allowing himself to simply watch. The flickering of the candles, the way the lights seemed to hold their own in the dark, gave him an unfamiliar warmth that spread through his chest. He didn't fully understand it, but there was something undeniable about it. It wasn't just the decorations. It was the quiet act of defiance, of clinging to something human, something normal, in a world that had stripped them of it all. It was a fragile thread, but it was a thread of connection. The silence that stretched between the two sides seemed to hold a promise, a fragile, unspoken truce, if only for a moment. The cold air that separated them felt less oppressive now, as if the small acts of decoration had woven an invisible thread of humanity across the battlefield, connecting them all in a shared longing for peace and normalcy, for a return to the world they had once known. The night deepened, and with it, the sky grew darker. But as the minutes ticked by, the stillness of the battlefield was broken by something more, a sound. It started as a faint, hesitant hum, rising from the German side, carried on the crisp night air. Mueller tilted his head, his brow furrowing as he tried to make sense of it. At first, it was so faint that he thought it might be the wind, but as it grew clearer, he realized it was music, a song, a Christmas carol. Mueller turned to Beck, his voice quiet but incredulous. "Do you hear that?" he asked, a trace of disbelief in his voice. Beck paused for a moment, his eyes narrowing as he listened, then nodded slowly. "It's Silent Night," he said softly, a tinge of wonder in his voice. "They're singing it." On the British side, Sergeant Jenkins and his men also heard the soft strains of the familiar carol. At first, they couldn't believe it either, unsure if they were imagining things, but the melody was unmistakable. Jenkins stood in the trench, his breath caught in his throat, as the hauntingly beautiful notes floated over the battlefield. For a moment, the world around them seemed to disappear. The war, the mud, the blood, none of it seemed to matter. All that existed was the song, its gentle notes carrying across the no-man's land, transcending the boundaries of language, nationality, and hate. Harris, who had been standing beside Jenkins, listened intently. A slow smile spread across his face as he turned to the sergeant. "It's Silent Night, Sarge," he said, his voice filled with a strange wonder. "They're singing it." Jenkins blinked, taken aback by the simplicity of the moment. It was like a dream, a fleeting escape from the madness that had consumed their lives for so long. "I never thought I'd hear something like that here," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. Slowly, the British soldiers began to listen, drawn in by the haunting beauty of the melody. Some stood silent, others leaned closer, and soon, one by one, they began to hum along. Jenkins, his heart unexpectedly lightened by the warmth of the song, joined in softly, his voice blending with that of the men around him. The soldiers on both sides were singing together, sharing something that went beyond the war. It was a shared moment of humanity, a glimpse of peace in the midst of madness. Muller, on the German side, found himself humming along too. The music wrapped around him like a comforting embrace, its familiar tones stirring memories of home, of Christmases long past, of simpler times before the war had come to claim everything. For a brief moment, the cold and the carnage faded away. The sound of the carol filled the space between the two sides, and the men enemies just hours before were connected by something pure and timeless. The song didn't ask for anything. It simply existed, offering solace, a reminder of the world outside the war. Mueller stood there, his eyes closed for a moment, as the melody swept over him. He had forgotten what it felt like to be free of the constant tension of the front lines, to be reminded of a time when life had been full of warmth and joy, not death and destruction. The carol, simple and sweet, seemed to transcend the walls of the trenches, carrying with it a sense of unity, a collective longing for something better. For just a few minutes, the war felt distant, like a story that belonged to another world, one that had been swallowed whole by the beauty of the music. The song filled the night air, its last notes hanging delicately in the silence that followed. After the final notes faded into the distance, Muller turned to Beck. His voice was soft, almost reverent, as he spoke. "Perhaps tonight we are just men, not enemies," he said quietly. There was a weight in his words, a fragile hope that had begun to take root in his heart. Beck, who had been lost in the music as well, nodded slowly. His eyes met Mueller's, and for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to believe that peace could one day be more than a fleeting dream. It was a small hope, fragile and uncertain, but it was a hope nonetheless. Muller's gaze turned once more to the flickering lights from the British side. The candles still burned, their light a symbol of something that had once been common to all people, the celebration of life, of love, of hope. And for the first time in what felt like forever, he allowed himself to hope that one day peace might come not just for a night, but forever. In that moment, as the men on both sides of the battlefield stood silently, the weight of war seemed to lift, if only for a brief instant. The flickering lights, the shared song, the unspoken understanding, they were enough to remind them that, despite everything, they were still human. And for that one night, they allowed themselves to believe in something greater than the war. They believed in each other. The night had grown colder, the wind biting through the trenches, whipping around the soldiers and stealing away the last bits of warmth they had managed to hold on to. It was as though the world had frozen in place. The only sounds, the soft crackling of firewood in the distance, and the occasional shuffle of boots in the mud. The oppressive quiet seemed to press down on everything, as if the world itself were waiting for something to happen, something to break the monotony of the war, the cold, and the endless waiting. The German side of the battlefield, too, was lost in the cold silence. Their soldiers huddled together in their own trenches, trying to find comfort wherever they could, though there was little enough to find. For months, they had endured the same horrors, the same suffering, and the same fear. Each soldier had become a shell of the man he once was, reduced to survival and the repetition of battle. And yet, in the middle of that endless despair, something unexpected stirred. It started small, a whisper, A single voice, tentative at first, rising above the stillness of the night. It was a fragile sound, a hint of something that didn't belong in the grim reality of the trenches. The melody was familiar to those who had heard it before, but it was different here, in the heart of the battlefield. It wasn't just a Christmas carol. It was a lifeline, a small thread of something beautiful in a world that had forgotten beauty. Stille Nacht, Heilige Nacht. The voice, though soft and uncertain, carried across the cold, cutting through the silence like a beam of light in the dark. It was the first sign of something other than war, something that spoke of peace, of a time when men weren't enemies. At the British trench, Private Williams was the first to hear it. His rifle was still clutched tightly in his hands, the familiar weight of it almost comforting. But as the gentle strains of the song reached his ears, something in him stirred a flicker of recognition, something he hadn't felt in months. He paused, his heart beating a little faster. Was it real? He strained his ears, leaning forward to catch more of the sound. "What's that?" Harris, standing beside him, asked, his voice low and confused. Williams turned his head slowly, still listening. He wasn't sure if it was his mind playing tricks on him. It couldn't be. It had to be real. "I think it's Christmas carols," Williams said, his voice trailing off, uncertain whether he was just imagining it. Another soldier, a younger man named Thompson, leaned forward from behind them. His face was pale from the grime of the trench, but his eyes were wide as he listened. His curiosity piqued. "Is that German?" The notes of Silent Night came through again, clearer now, drifting on the wind like a distant echo. It wasn't a trick, it was real. The Germans were singing. There was no mistaking it. The song, so familiar, so full of memories of home, of peace, of a world untouched by war here. In this hellish place, it was somehow still alive. For a moment, none of them spoke. Williams could hear it now, the melody carrying over the field, gentle and sorrowful. And as the sounds grew clearer, something strange began to happen. The air seemed to shift. The ever-present weight of fear and hatred lifted, if only a little, and something tender began to creep into the hearts of the men. Williams looked at Harris, his brow furrowing. "Should we?" Harris hesitated. He knew better than to trust anything in this war. There had been moments before, small gestures, like this one, that had turned into traps. The enemy could use this as a trick. Maybe it was a ruse to get them to lower their guard, to leave their trench and walk into a hail of bullets. It seemed absurd, this idea of peace amid the violence. And yet, the song, the music had reached something deep within him. "It could be a trick," Harris said cautiously, his hand instinctively tightening around his rifle. But Williams, who had already taken a few steps forward, ignored the warning. He took a deep breath, feeling the cold air in his lungs, and in one decisive motion, climbed up the trench wall. He raised his hand, unsure of what would happen next, unsure of anything anymore. But he raised his voice, and he joined the Germans in their song. "Silent night, holy night," he sang softly, his voice trembling with something close to wonder, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in months. Harris stood still for a long moment, staring at his friend. He was torn between fear and curiosity, between instinct and something more. Slowly, cautiously, as if afraid the very ground beneath him might crack, he followed. He joined in, his voice a low hum at first, and then stronger as the melody took hold of him. And then, something remarkable happened. Other soldiers, too, began to sing. One by one, they joined in, their voices trembling but growing bolder with every note. From both sides of the battlefield, the carol spread. The haunting lullaby of silent night echoed across the no man's land, a sound so fragile yet so powerful that for a moment it felt like nothing could touch them. The music was a bridge, a link that defied the boundaries of language and war. It connected the soldiers not as enemies, not as men who had killed and bled and suffered on this battlefield, but as humans, as brothers. They had been taught to fear each other, to hate each other, but now, for just a brief moment, they were united in something that transcended all of that. The night air, once cold and suffocating, now felt warmer. The song, floating above the trenches, lifted the spirits of the men in a way that no order, no command, no battle ever had. The rifles once raised in anger were lowered. The tension, so thick it had been suffocating, began to ease. And with it, the faintest flicker of something else took its place. Hope. It was fleeting, fragile, but it was there. In the stillness that followed the last notes of the song, the field lay quiet, the air charged with something intangible. It was in that silence that a tentative truce seemed to emerge. And then, from the German side, a figure appeared. A soldier, one of the Germans, stepped forward cautiously from the trench. In his hands, he carried a small candle. It flickered in the wind, a beacon of light in the darkness, casting a soft glow on his face. His eyes, though tired, were filled with a quiet determination. Williams and Harris exchanged glances. Their hearts were racing, their minds filled with uncertainty. But in that moment, they didn't hesitate. They climbed out of the trench together, hands held up in a gesture of goodwill, unsure what would happen next, but knowing that it was something they had to do. The moment had arrived, and neither of them wanted to miss it. And so, slowly, cautiously, they stepped forward into the no man's land between them. It was no longer the battlefield of death. It was a sanctuary now, a place where, for a short while, enemies had become brothers. The other soldiers, too, followed, each one emerging from their trenches and joining in the shared space, no longer strangers, no longer enemies. They began to exchange small gifts, chocolate, cigarettes, buttons, and the simple things that reminded them of home. There were no words at first, just a soft laughter that echoed through the night, the sound of men who had forgotten what it felt like to laugh, to connect with another person beyond the distance of a rifle. They sat together in the mud, talking, sharing stories about their families, about their homes, about the world they had left behind. There were stories of Christmases past, of dreams for the future, of hopes that had been buried beneath the weight of the war. It was a rare moment, fleeting and delicate. The men were still soldiers, still trapped in a war that none of them had wanted. But in that brief window, they were also human, just men, bound by the same struggles, the same hopes, the same yearning for peace. As the night wore on and the cold began to creep back into their bones, they knew that it couldn't last forever. The war would return. The dawn would come, bringing with it the reality of the world they lived in. But as the soldiers climbed back into their trenches, heavy hearts weighed down by the knowledge of what they would face again, they carried with them the memory of that night, the memory of the truce, of the music, of the shared humanity that had connected them, if only for a few hours. And in the quiet that followed, as the first light of dawn touched the sky, they knew that peace, even for a moment, had been theirs. A fleeting victory, more powerful than any battle. A simple melody had done what armies could not, a moment of peace amidst the violence. The whispers of that night lingered long after the sun had risen, a gentle reminder that beneath the uniforms and the scars, they were all part of the same tapestry of life. They returned to their posts, but something had changed. A seed of hope had been planted in the soil of despair, one that might someday bloom into understanding and reconciliation. The officers, too, took notice of the rare camaraderie. Though bound by duty to maintain discipline and order, even they felt the impact of that extraordinary exchange. It was as if, for a brief moment, the world had taken a collective breath, pausing to remember humanity at its core. As letters were written home, tales of the truce spread, becoming legends of kindness amidst chaos. Stories to be told and retold by firesides and in quiet moments of reflection. Families heard of the night their sons had laid down arms to embrace their supposed enemies, and it brought a flicker of hope to those waiting anxiously for their return. The war raged on, as wars often do, but the memory of that night remained a beacon in the darkness, a testament to the power of empathy and the resilience of the human spirit. It reminded them that even in the harshest of times, there was a possibility for connection, a chance for peace. And perhaps in the end, that was what they fought for, a world where nights like that could last forever. The soldiers stood in a hushed silence, their hearts heavy with conflicting emotions. The night had been alive with something they hadn't expected, a spark of peace, a brief moment of humanity that seemed to transcend the battle lines drawn in the mud and blood. The song, Silent Night, had carried across no man's land, and for a fleeting instant, it had felt like the war itself had paused. But now, as the last echoes of the carol faded into the night, doubt began to creep in. Was this truly peace? Or was it just a trap? Could the enemy, who had been trying to kill them just hours before, suddenly shift so completely? Could this moment of calm be genuine? Or was it a tactic, a distraction meant to lull them into lowering their guard? Across the field, on the German side, Müller and Beck exchanged uncertain looks. The night air was still, too still, and the haunting beauty of the carol that had drifted through the cold was beginning to feel like an eerie prelude to something far darker. Beck, always the optimist between the two, wanted to believe it was real. The warmth that the song had kindled in his chest was still there, flickering faintly like the dying embers of a fire. It felt like something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. For a brief moment, it had seemed possible that there was more to life than war, more to life than the endless suffering and fear. He longed for it to be real, for this fragile moment of calm to be something tangible, something they could hold on to. Maybe it is real, Beck said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. His eyes met Muller's, searching for some kind of reassurance. Maybe we need it to be real. Mueller's gaze drifted away, his mind far from the hopeful words his comrade had spoken. His instincts screamed caution, an old ingrained reflex that had kept him alive in the worst of battles. This moment was too much like a dream, too out of place. Everything he had known, everything he had been trained to believe, told him that this could not be real. War was not about peace. War was about survival, about killing, about fear. This can't be real, Muller muttered, his voice hoarse, as though the very idea was too heavy to bear. It's too quiet. Beck looked at him, his brow furrowing. Too quiet? He tilted his head, trying to make sense of Mueller's words. He wanted to argue, to convince him that this was something good, something worth holding on to. Maybe this is what we need, Mueller. Maybe this is what we've been waiting for all along. The two men stood there, the silence between them stretching out longer than it should have, an uncomfortable weight settling in. The song, the memory of it, still lingered in the air around them, and for a moment, neither of them knew what to say. They weren't soldiers now. They weren't enemies. They were simply men who, for the briefest of moments, had shared something human in a place where humanity had all but disappeared. The music had been soft, almost tender, as though the earth itself were sighing. It had woven through the night like a delicate thread, a fragile thing that threatened to snap at the slightest tug. The melody had carried memories with it, memories of home, of mothers and fathers, of children's laughter and Christmas dinners. It had taken them back to a time before the war, when peace was something they had taken for granted. As the last notes of the carol faded, Mueller closed his eyes for a moment, letting the silence envelop him. "I remember when music meant celebration," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "It used to be something we looked forward to. Now," he trailed off, shaking his head, "now it feels like a requiem, a goodbye to everything we used to know." Beck placed a hand on his shoulder, offering a small measure of comfort, though his own thoughts were far from clear. "Maybe it's both," he said quietly, his voice steady, though his mind raced with uncertainty. "Maybe it's a farewell to the past, and a welcome to whatever comes next." Mueller didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stood there, looking out over the field, his gaze distant, his mind lost in the quiet storm of conflicting thoughts. He didn't want to believe that this was real, but something about the moment, something about the way the world had seemed to hold its breath, made him wonder. Could it be that peace, even for a night, was possible? Could it be that something beyond the war had reached out, had pulled them together for a brief moment of understanding? The sun, though hidden behind a veil of clouds, was dipping lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the frozen field. The sky was a dusky blue, the remnants of light slowly giving way to the oncoming night. It felt like time itself was suspended, the minutes stretching long and slow, and for a fleeting instant, the soldiers on both sides seemed to share the same thought. The war, the fighting, the hatred, could it all end, even if just for this moment? The weight of it all was almost unbearable. The soldiers, each caught between the gnawing hope that peace might be possible and the deep-set skepticism born of years of violence, stood silently, taking in the rare tranquility around them. It was as if the world itself was holding its breath, unsure of what was coming next, unsure whether to embrace the peace or prepare for the violence to return. But just as quickly as the peace had arrived, it was shattered. A rustle in the underbrush, a small noise that no one could ignore, pulled them back to the present. It was as though the world had suddenly snapped back into focus, the peace dissolving like mist in the morning Sunday. The soldiers' instincts kicked in immediately. The moment of quiet, of shared humanity, was over, replaced once again by the harsh reality of war. Mueller and Beck froze, their eyes scanning the horizon. The hairs on the back of their necks stood up as they tensed, waiting for the next sound, the next movement. What had been a fragile, tenuous moment of camaraderie now felt dangerous. Was this the beginning of a trap? Was it time for the fighting to start again? The rustling in the bushes could have been anything. It could have been an animal, a stray piece of debris, or it could have been something much worse. Their minds raced with possibilities, their bodies frozen in the tension of uncertainty. "Let's keep moving," Mueller said, his voice low and steady, his training taking over. He took a step forward, motioning for Beck to follow, but his gaze lingered on the distant shadows, searching for any sign of danger. Beck hesitated, still caught between the strange lull of the moment and the harsh instinct to survive. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice unsure. Maybe it's nothing." Mueller didn't respond right away. He couldn't afford to second-guess himself. The war had taught him that hesitation could cost him his life. "Keep moving," he repeated, his voice more insistent now. Reluctantly, Beck nodded and followed him. But even as they trudged forward, the memory of the song, of the peace that had come and gone, lingered in their minds. The melody, soft and haunting, continued to play in the background of their thoughts, a beacon of something better, something worth fighting for. The uncertainty ahead was vast, the war still raging, but in their hearts, the flicker of hope, the hope that peace, even if only for a moment, was possible, would continue to guide them, no matter what lay ahead. As the soldiers moved cautiously forward, the shadows deepened, and the war crept back into their minds. But the memory of that fleeting moment of peace lingered in their hearts, a reminder of what they were truly fighting for, a future where such moments could be more than a fleeting dream. The first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, casting a cold, pale light across the battlefield. The ground was frozen, the remnants of the night's frost glimmering under the weak sunlight. The air still carried the heavy weight of tension. But something else had begun to grow, something more fragile, more uncertain. A silence stretched over the land, and in that silence, a strange, tentative hope began to take root. The events of the previous night songs, sung across enemy lines, gestures of goodwill, had left both sides in a strange limbo. The soldiers had shared a moment of peace, but as dawn arrived, the realization that the fighting would continue, that they were still at war, began to creep back into their minds. They were still soldiers, still men who had seen too much, lost too much. But now, as the first light of day touched the frost-covered ground, something changed. A spark had been ignited. At first, it was just a solitary figure. A German soldier, his face covered in dirt and exhaustion, hesitated at the edge of his trench. He glanced over his shoulder, his breath clouding in the cold air, and slowly, almost as if unsure of what he was about to do, he stepped forward, holding a tattered white flag in his hands. Jenkins, standing at the edge of the British trench, saw him first. His eyes narrowed, unsure of what he was witnessing. A white flag, the universal symbol of surrender. But this wasn't a battle-ending moment, not a planned ceasefire, just a soldier, on his own, reaching out. His heart beat faster, a mix of disbelief and caution gripping him. He turned to Harris, who was standing beside him, rifle in hand, still wary of the possibility of danger. "Do you think?" Jenkins's voice trailed off, his question hanging in the air. Before Harris could respond, Jenkins grabbed his rifle, ready to respond to whatever might come next. But then he hesitated. Something about this soldier's gesture, his quiet surrender, pulled at something inside Jenkins. For a moment, he wasn't a sergeant or a soldier. He was just a man, standing on a battlefield that was starting to feel too small, too wrong for the violence that had defined it. Without thinking further, Jenkins slowly lowered his rifle and climbed out of the trench. He held his hands up, fingers spread wide. He wasn't sure what would happen next, but he knew he had to do something. He had to see what this moment could be. The German soldier stopped when he saw Jenkins, his eyes scanning the British soldier for any sign of aggression. The tension was palpable between them, but neither side moved. There were no words yet, just the soft, uncertain sounds of men shifting on both sides of the field, unsure of what to make of this strange and fragile pause in the madness. For a few heartbeats, it seemed as though time had stopped. Then, as if by unspoken agreement, other soldiers began to emerge from their trenches, hesitant but driven by a shared impulse. First one, then another, soldiers on both sides slowly raising their hands, offering the universal sign of peace. Neither side fired. Neither side moved too quickly. They stood there, frozen, across the cold expanse of no man's land, looking at each other for the first time, not as enemies, but as humans. And then it happened. A British soldier, his face gaunt with fatigue, stepped forward. His voice, though shaky, carried through the quiet. "Merry Christmas," he said, his words laced with disbelief, uncertainty, but also something else, something vulnerable. His eyes were wide with the strange realization that for the first time in months, perhaps years, he wasn't sure what to do. He wasn't sure if this was real, if peace could even be possible, but he said it anyway. The words were simple, but they felt like a bridge, fragile and tentative. A German soldier, equally weary, stepped forward in turn. His face was thinner, his eyes shadowed with the weight of the war, but there was a warmth there now, a flicker of something familiar. "Merry Christmas," he replied, his accent thick but the meaning unmistakable. His voice, too, was unsure, but it carried the weight of shared experience, of shared longing for something, anything that might offer respite. And in that moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. The war, the bloodshed, the hatred, all of it faded for a brief moment. In its place stood two men, no longer soldiers in that instant, but simply two human beings meeting in the middle of a battlefield. Slowly, more soldiers from both sides began to emerge from the trenches. They moved cautiously, as if testing the waters, unsure of how this would unfold. But the hesitation that had marked their first steps was slowly replaced by something else, a shared sense of recognition. They weren't enemies now. They were men, bound together by the same struggles, the same losses. They had been soldiers, but for this moment, they were something else entirely. The tension in the air began to thaw. Some soldiers extended their hands, offering small gestures of goodwill. Chocolates, cigarettes, buttons, small tokens, but powerful in their simplicity. The air, once thick with the threat of violence, now hummed with the soft murmur of conversation. The men spoke in broken English and German, their words fragmented but filled with understanding. They shared stories of their families, of their homes, of the lives they had left behind. They talked of their hopes, their fears, their dreams for a future that seemed so far away in the chaos of war. One of the British soldiers produced a battered football, and a murmur of interest spread quickly among the gathered men. The ball was kicked back and forth, its path uncertain but full of energy. The soldiers, though still in their muddy boots and torn uniforms, had found something they had long forgotten: the joy of play. The shouts of encouragement rang out across the battlefield, replaced now by laughter, the sound so foreign and yet so welcome in the midst of all the pain. For a few hours, the war faded into the background. The distant thunder of artillery seemed muffled, as if the sound itself had been swallowed by the growing camaraderie between the two sides. There were no shots fired, no orders barked, no plans to advance. There was only this moment, a strange, fragile truce, born from the shared humanity of men who had been trained to fight each other, but who, for just a brief time, had remembered what it meant to be human. The sun climbed higher, its rays casting a golden light over the frost-kissed earth. The soldiers, though still wary of the danger that might come, seemed to have shed their armor, if only for a moment. They stood side by side, their voices mingling, the sound of laughter and conversation, a far cry from the gunfire and shouting that had dominated their lives for so long. But as the minutes passed and the shadows stretched longer, the harsh reality of war began to creep back into their thoughts. The truce had been a gift, but it couldn't last. As the sun continued its climb, casting its warm light over the battlefield, the soldiers knew that the war would return. The next day, they would once again be enemies. They would return to their posts, to their weapons, to their roles in the conflict. But for now, they allowed themselves to savor the peace, however fleeting. They etched the memory of this extraordinary day into their hearts, carrying it with them as a reminder of what could be, even in the darkest of times. A reminder that for a brief moment, they had shared something more than the violence and hatred that had consumed their world. They had shared something human. When the time came to part, there was a palpable reluctance. The soldiers clasped hands in farewell, their grip firm, their gazes lingering with something like a promise. A promise that, perhaps after the war, there could be a better world, a world where they wouldn't have to fight. Perhaps they would meet again in peace, when the guns had fallen silent forever. With heavy hearts, they climbed back into their trenches. The temporary ceasefire was over, but its impact lingered, like a soft, warm glow in the chest of each soldier who had taken part. The memories of those precious hours, of the kindness and laughter shared across the battlefield, would stay with them, a beacon of hope amid the darkness of war. The ceasefire had been brief, but its message was clear. Even in the darkest of times, there is always the possibility of light. Even in the deepest despair, there is always the chance for humanity to reach across the divide and find something worth fighting for. Something more than just survival, something worth living for. The day unfolded in a way that no one could have predicted. What had started as a temporary truce, a brief moment of shared humanity between men who had been trained to kill each other, now began to evolve into something even more unexpected, a connection. The frost-covered earth, once a battleground, had become something else entirely. As the morning sun began to break through the clouds, casting long, uncertain shadows across the battlefield, the soldiers from both sides found themselves standing side by side, not as enemies, but as men, brothers, even, for just this one day. It was a small, tentative step at first. A single soldier, a British private named Williams, kicked a muddy ball across the makeshift no-man's land. The ball rolled through the dirt, awkwardly bouncing in the uneven ground, but it caught the attention of a German soldier standing nearby. The German soldier hesitated at first, eyeing the ball as if unsure whether this was some kind of trick. But then, with a look of resolve, he lunged forward, his boots slipping in the mud as he attempted to block the ball. Williams laughed, a sound that felt foreign in his own ears, but one that seemed to release something inside him, a laugh not born from fear or nervousness, but from something simpler, something human. "You play like my little brother," he called out with a grin, his voice laced with amusement. The German soldier, his face smeared with dirt and exhaustion, grinned back despite the language barrier. "Your brother would have been a poor footballer," he said, his voice light and full of humor, and for that fleeting moment, the divide between them disappeared. They weren't soldiers anymore. They were just two men, enjoying the shared simplicity of a game. The two soldiers stood there for a moment, still unsure of the next move, but the rest of the men began to take notice. A few British soldiers approached cautiously, their faces a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. Slowly, they joined in. The ball was kicked again, and soon it was being passed back and forth, slowly at first, clumsily, but with growing enthusiasm. The German soldiers began to join in as well, and what had started as a tentative game began to take shape. There were no rules, no goals, just the simple pleasure of movement. The mud and the cold seemed to fall away with every kick, every pass, as the soldiers from both sides let themselves forget for a moment where they were, who they were. The game itself was nothing, just a few men kicking a ball in the middle of a battlefield. But in that moment, it became everything. The war, the trenches, the guns, and the orders, they didn't matter. What mattered was this shared connection, this brief respite from the relentless brutality that had defined their lives for so long. As the game continued, the laughter grew louder. The soldiers exchanged banter, teasing one another about their skill or lack thereof on the field. One German soldier laughed as he tripped over the ball, falling to the muddy ground. "I should have stayed at home with my grandmother," he joked, a small, tired smile spreading across his face. The British soldiers chuckled, shaking their heads in mock disbelief. For a brief, fleeting moment, the battlefield was transformed. It wasn't a place of violence, or death, or fear. It was a field, a place for play, for laughter, for connection. It was as though the war had never existed, or at least had been put on pause, and in its place stood something simpler, more human. Nearby, a small group of soldiers had gathered around a fire. The flickering flames cast a warm, golden light over their faces, the crackling of the fire a gentle backdrop to the sounds of the game. One of the men, a German private named Muller, pulled out a harmonica. He had carried it with him through the war, tucked into his pack like a relic from a life before this hell. Now he lifted it to his lips, and the plaintive notes filled the air, a melody that seemed to carry both sorrow and hope in equal measure. The music was soft, the tune slow and mournful, but there was something in it, something that resonated in the hearts of the men standing around the fire. Slowly, almost instinctively, a few of them began to sing. Their voices were low at first, tentative, but as the music continued, they grew bolder. The words were simple, but they carried weight. It wasn't the language that mattered, but the meaning. For a few moments, the song became a bridge, a connection that transcended the language of war and the chaos of the world around them. The soldiers sang softly, some of them in broken English, others in German, but the harmony between them was clear. There was no need for translation. They were singing the same song, together, and that was enough. It was a language that didn't require words, a language of shared longing, of shared humanity. As the day wore on, and the sun began to dip lower in the sky, the battlefield grew quiet once more, but in a different way. The air was still, peaceful, as if the very earth were breathing a sigh of relief. The soldiers continued to play their game of soccer. their voices still mingling with the sounds of the harmonica, their laughter echoing through the cold evening air. And then, when the game finally wound down, the soldiers began to gather in small groups, sitting together on the ground, sharing whatever little they had: bread, cigarettes, whatever they had brought with them from their homes, or whatever they had managed to scrounge up over the course of the war. They exchanged small tokens, small gestures of kindness that, in the context of the war, felt like monumental acts of humanity. One of the British soldiers, a man named Andrews, shared some of his last chocolate with a German soldier who had been eyeing it from across the field. The German soldier smiled gratefully, breaking off a small piece and offering it back to Andrews. It was a small exchange, but it felt like a victory, like something that mattered in a way the war never could. They talked about their families, about their homes, about the lives they had left behind, and the things they longed to return to. They spoke in broken words, stilted sentences, but it didn't matter. The meaning was clear. They were men, not enemies, not soldiers, just men. And in that moment, they weren't fighting for victory or glory. They weren't fighting for orders or duty. They were simply fighting for the chance to live, to survive, to hold on to something human in the face of all the destruction, all the loss. As the last light of day began to fade, the soldiers slowly began to gather their things, knowing that the ceasefire could not last forever. The war would return, the guns would fire again, and they would be soldiers once more. But for now, they had shared something rare, something extraordinary, something worth remembering. They parted reluctantly, each soldier returning to his side of the battlefield, the moment of peace slipping away like a dream. But as they walked back to their trenches, there was something different in their hearts. They had seen each other for what they were: men, not enemies. And for a brief time, they had shared the most simple and powerful thing of all: humanity. The echoes of their shared moments lingered in the cold evening air, a testament to what could happen when the world paused long enough to listen to the human heart. The ceasefire had been brief, but it had been enough. For a moment, in the middle of war, the soldiers had found common ground, and in doing so, they had found something far greater than anything the battlefield could offer: the possibility of peace. The day stretched on, bathed in the soft light of the winter sun, and with it, the feeling of something more profound than the usual grim determination that defined the soldiers' days. What had started as a fleeting pause in the violence, a brief truce brokered by the Christmas spirit, had now turned into something more: a shared moment of peace that was slowly weaving itself into the very fabric of their lives. It wasn't just the cessation of fighting. It was a collective realization that, despite everything, they were more alike than different. The shared understanding between the men once enemies was deepening, and it was something neither side had expected. The soldiers, weary from the long months of conflict, were beginning to see each other for what they truly were: men who had been caught in the gears of a war not of their making. Private Harrison, a British soldier, had found himself sitting on the edge of a makeshift fire, his hands still trembling from the cold and the exhaustion. He had been through battles that left him feeling hollow inside, a ghost of the man he had once been. But now, surrounded by soldiers who had been his enemies just a day ago, he felt an odd sense of camaraderie stirring inside him. One of the German soldiers, Private Muller, sat beside him, and despite the initial tension, there was something between them now, something human. Harrison, feeling the weight of the silence hanging between them, gestured to the small fire in front of them. "Would you like some tea?" he asked, his voice hoarse from the dryness of the cold. Muller hesitated, looking at Harrison with suspicion at first, then softened when he saw the other soldiers around them, none of whom seemed inclined to pick up their rifles. "Tea?" Mueller echoed, raising an eyebrow. "I don't think I've had any since the last time I was home." "Well, it's a small comfort," Harrison replied, with a half-smile, his shaking hands carefully reaching into his kit for the small tin of tea leaves he'd brought from home. His fingers trembled, not just from the cold, but from the realization that in the middle of war, there was something almost absurd in making tea for a man he had just been trying to kill. But here, in this strange, shared silence, the act of offering something simple, something from a better time, felt like the right thing to do. Mueller watched closely as Harrison poured hot water over the tea leaves. His gaze was intense, as if the sight of this small ritual, so ordinary and yet so out of place here, held some kind of unspoken meaning. "This is how we do it back home," Harrison explained, his voice quieter now, almost reverent. "We've always had tea with our families. It's something you look forward to when the day is done." Muller watched the steam rise from the cup, the scent of the tea filling the cold air. "Back home," he repeated softly, as if tasting the word on his tongue. He reached for the cup and took a careful sip, his eyes closed for a moment as the warmth spread through him. This tastes like home," he said quietly, his voice almost breaking. For Harrison, the moment felt almost sacred. Here they were, two men, one from England and one from Germany, finding a brief moment of connection over something as simple as tea. In the midst of all the destruction, this small act of kindness felt monumental. Nearby, another exchange was taking place. A German soldier named Beck, who had been watching the two men with quiet curiosity, was now squatting down beside a British soldier, a rifle resting beside him. Beck motioned to the rifle, and the British soldier, a young man named Thomas, looked up, his brow furrowed in confusion. "Would you like help with that?" Beck asked in halting English, nodding at Thomas's rifle. Thomas blinked, caught off guard by the offer. They were soldiers, enemies, yet Beck was offering to help him, not in a battle, but in maintaining his weapon. Something so trivial, so civilian in comparison to the horrors they had both witnessed. For a brief moment, it seemed absurd, but at the same time, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. Thomas hesitated, but then nodded. "Sure. I guess I could use a hand." Beck smiled, the expression light but filled with a warmth that Thomas hadn't expected. As Beck worked with the rifle, explaining each step in broken English, Thomas felt something shift inside him. He had spent so long fighting and surviving, only to have a man he had been trained to hate help him with something so simple. It was strange. He felt a small knot of tension loosening inside him. They shared a quiet, unspoken understanding between them, their eyes meeting now and then, as if acknowledging that they had more in common than they ever thought possible. They were both just men, doing the best they could in a world that had spun out of control. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the battlefield, the soldiers, still hesitant but driven by something beyond fear or duty, gathered around small makeshift fires. The cold was still biting, but the warmth of the fire was something that the soldiers clung to, something they could feel across the distance that had once seemed so vast between them. Laughter began to trickle from the group as they shared stories, and for the first time in months, there was a softness in the air, a feeling that could only be described as camaraderie. They were not soldiers on opposite sides anymore. They were simply men struggling through the same chaos. They were united in something more than just survival. They were united in their shared humanity. One of the British soldiers, a young man named Ben, pulled out a harmonica he had kept hidden in his jacket for months. He had brought it from home, though he had never imagined he would play it in the middle of a war. He put it to his lips and began to play a soft tune, a simple melody, but one that carried with it a world of meaning. The notes were slow, mournful, like a lullaby, and they wrapped around the soldiers as the sun sank lower, casting an orange glow across the land. The sound of the harmonica filled the silence between the men, a bridge between the chaos of battle and the fragile peace that had settled over them. For a moment, it was as though the war itself had stopped. The men stopped talking, their attention drawn to the music. They listened, each one lost in his own thoughts, remembering things long buried: the sound of their mothers' voices, the warmth of family gatherings, the quiet evenings back home. The music connected them to a past that felt so far away now, but which they all longed for. And then, in the midst of the haunting melody, a German soldier stepped forward. He was older than most of the men, his face worn by the ravages of war. He had been standing silently by the fire, listening to the harmonica. When he saw the looks of anticipation from the others, he nodded slowly, almost to himself. And then he began to sing. His voice was deep and rich, carrying the weight of his homeland's history. The song was familiar to some of the British soldiers, an old folk tune passed down through generations. His voice filled the air, powerful yet tender, and for a moment, the war was forgotten entirely. There was no violence in his song, no enemies. There were just voices, just men standing together in the soft, fading light, their hearts momentarily at peace. The haunting beauty of the song lingered in the air, a reminder that beneath the uniforms and the guns, they were all human. They shared the same fears, the same longings, and for a few moments, the world seemed small again. A place where peace was possible even in the most unlikely of places. As night began to fall, the soldiers, still reluctant to leave the fragile peace they had forged, exchanged small tokens, photographs of home, lucky charms, pieces of chocolate. These things, though small, were symbolic of something bigger, the hope that, somehow, peace might be possible in the future. They shared what little they had, each gesture a quiet expression of goodwill. The air was cool and calm now, but beneath the quiet of the night was something stronger. The bond of shared experience, shared humanity. They were not soldiers in that moment. They were simply men, men who had seen too much and lost too much, but who, for a brief time, had found something they thought they had lost forever. As they began to return to their respective trenches, their movements slow and reluctant, the night felt different. It felt like a promise, a memory etched into their hearts. The ceasefire was over, and the war would continue. But in the quiet, beneath the stars, they carried something precious with them, a reminder that even in the darkest times, there was still light. And as they drifted to sleep, surrounded by the quiet of the night, each soldier held on to the shared dream of a future where kindness, peace, and humanity would outlast the war. The evening settled quietly over the battlefield, the day's brief truce fading into the distance like a dream that had never fully taken shape. As the sun dipped below the horizon, leaving behind only a dim, dying light, the soldiers began to slowly return to their respective sides. The ceasefire, once a rare and fragile gift, was now a thing of the past. The distant echoes of laughter, the shared moments of peace, seemed to slip away like sand through their fingers. The reality of war, harsh and unforgiving, returned with a vengeance, creeping in like the inevitable cold that followed the setting Sunday. Jenkins stood alone at the edge of the British trench, his eyes fixed on the no-man's land that had just moments ago been a place of unlikely camaraderie. His helmet sat crooked on his head, the weight of it grounding him, as though it were a reminder of what he had been, what he still was. He was a soldier, a man caught in the madness of a war that showed no sign of slowing, no promise of peace. The game, the laughter, the songs they had all felt like a lifetime ago, a fleeting escape that now felt almost impossible to believe in. But it had happened. He would carry it with him, even if only for a little while. "I won't forget this," he muttered to Harris, his voice low but steady, as if speaking the words out loud would somehow make the memory of the truce more permanent, more real. Harris, standing next to him, nodded slowly, his face unreadable in the fading light. "Neither will I," he replied, his voice heavy with something Jenkins couldn't quite place. A sadness, perhaps. Or maybe something else, something deeper, like a longing for a world that no longer existed. But even as the words hung between them, the moment was shattered by the distant sound of gunfire, sharp and jarring. The noise cracked through the air, a harsh, familiar reminder of the world they were still trapped in, the world of war. Jenkins didn't move at first, the sound of the gunfire ringing in his ears, almost too loud for him to ignore. His hand instinctively moved to his rifle, fingers brushing over the worn stock, the weight of it comforting in a way he couldn't explain. "We never get a break, do we?" he said quietly, more to himself than to Harris. The words were empty, but there was something real in them, something that hit too close to home. Harris shrugged slightly, his posture stiff as he turned to face the horizon. "I guess not. Not until the war's over." His voice was distant, resigned. He didn't offer any other words, because there weren't any to give. The war, like the sky that now darkened above them, was endless. It stretched on and on, consuming everything in its path. The silence between them felt thick, heavy with the weight of unspoken fears, unacknowledged dreams. They both knew that the war wasn't over. They both knew that the peace they'd shared, however brief, was gone. And yet, even as they turned back to their trenches, picking up their weapons and preparing to return to their posts, there was something different in their eyes. Something that had shifted, however imperceptibly. A tiny flicker of light, fragile and fleeting, but still there. It wasn't enough to change the course of the war, but it was enough to change them, even if just for a little while. Jenkins adjusted his helmet, the small, comforting weight of it suddenly feeling like a burden again. "Do you think it'll ever end?" he asked, his voice barely rising above a whisper. Harris didn't immediately respond. He stared into the fading light, as though the answer could be found somewhere in the horizon. His eyes were tired, too tired to offer anything optimistic. Finally, after a long pause, he spoke, his voice thick with a weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion. "I hope so. But until then, we just keep moving forward." There was nothing more to say after that. They both knew that hope, though precious, was a rare commodity in times like these. It was fragile, like the last few embers of a fire that had almost burned out. But it was all they had, all anyone had. Hope, no matter how fleeting, was the only thing that kept them going. Without it, they might as well have laid down their rifles and surrendered to the darkness. The soldiers began to drift back to their camps, their movements slow and heavy with the weight of what had just passed, and with the knowledge of what was still to come. The night air grew colder as they set up their makeshift shelters, the flickering light of distant fires casting long, erratic shadows against the ground. The campfires, so much like the ones they had shared just hours before, now felt distant, foreign, as though the camaraderie had already begun to fade too. But still, there was laughter, soft murmurs, as the men tried to carve out some small semblance of normalcy in a world that had been turned upside down. Some talked of their homes, of what they would do when the war was over, though they all knew deep down that such thoughts were a luxury. They talked of food, of simple pleasures that felt like distant memories now, warm meals, the smell of fresh bread, the sound of children playing. And in those brief moments, it felt almost like they were human again, not soldiers bound by duty or bloodshed. They were just men, sharing stories by the fire. But beneath the laughter, there was something unspoken, an understanding that had begun to form between them, a bond forged not by their uniforms or their allegiances, but by the shared experience of survival. They had been enemies, but now, if only for a moment, they were something else. They were brothers, bound together by something deeper than the war that had once divided them. In the quiet of the night, under the stars that seemed to flicker overhead like fragile, dying embers, the soldiers found something rare and precious: empathy. Jenkins sat with Harris, staring into the fire, his mind wandering to places he didn't often allow himself to go. His thoughts were dark, filled with the knowledge that this peace, this fragile truce, could never last. But still, in the back of his mind, something small, something stubborn refused to be extinguished. He thought about his family, his home, the life that had once seemed so certain, so full of promise. He thought about the men around him, their faces marked by the same weariness, the same longing for a life they'd left behind. He thought about the small acts of kindness shared earlier, the warmth of the fire, the sound of laughter. They weren't just soldiers anymore. They were people. "What do you think, Harris?" Jenkins asked, his voice low. "Do you think this war will ever end?" Harris's eyes were distant, lost in the firelight. He didn't answer right away, but when he did, his voice was thick with something deeper than just fatigue. "I don't know, Sarge. I really don't. But I'll keep hoping. I'll keep fighting." "Because what else is there?" Jenkins nodded, his mind swirling with 1,000 thoughts. The war would continue. The battles would rage. But maybe, just maybe, there was still a chance, however small, that something good could come of it all. Something real. The fire crackled in the distance, and the men settled into their makeshift camps for the night. Their eyes grew heavy, their thoughts drifting like the smoke rising from the flames. And under the cold, indifferent sky, they fell asleep with the faintest sliver of hope still burning in their hearts. A hope that someday peace might not just be a dream, but something they could hold on to, even in the darkest of times. But for now, all they could do was wait for the morning and face the world they had to live in once more. The evening came softly, like the final breath before sleep, and the soldiers, though tired and reluctant, began to gather their things. They stood at the edges of their trenches, looking across the field at men who had once been enemies now, in some strange way, something else. The distant hum of artillery had been replaced by the echoes of shared laughter, and for a moment it had seemed as if the war itself had paused. The ceasefire, brief and fragile, had brought them together, if only for a fleeting time. Now, as the sun dipped lower in the sky, the light softened, casting long shadows over the muddy, frozen earth. The soldiers stood silently, the weight of what had transpired heavy in the air. The laughter, the games, the conversations now all felt like a distant memory, as if they had never happened at all. Yet, in the silence between them, a bond had been formed. It wasn't the kind of bond that could be explained in words, nor was it one forged through years of friendship. It was something deeper, something born from the shared experience of war, of survival, of brief moments of peace. Jenkins stood at the front of the British line, his gaze lingering on the field where, only hours ago, men from both sides had crossed into each other's territory, not as enemies, but as something more. He had shared tea with a German soldier, something that would have seemed impossible just days ago. He had heard their laughter, seen their faces, tired and worn just like his own. And now, with the day drawing to a close, they were returning to their respective trenches, back to the roles they had been assigned in this endless conflict. Before heading back to his trench, Jenkins caught sight of the German soldier with whom he had shared that brief, unexpected moment. The soldier, a man named Mueller, was standing at the edge of the no man's land, his eyes meeting Jenkins's in a silent understanding. There were no words between them, no need for any. The glance they exchanged said everything, an acknowledgment of the humanity they had shared, the fleeting connection they had formed, and the unspoken promise that, for that brief time, they were not enemies. Jenkins gave a small, almost imperceptible nod to Mueller, and the German soldier returned it, a subtle gesture that conveyed more than any word could. In that moment, there was a quiet understanding between them, a moment of peace that neither could fully grasp, but both could feel. The weight of it pressed in on them, the knowledge that just a few hours ago they had been trying to kill each other, and now, here they were, standing in silence, bound by something that transcended nationalities, uniforms, and orders. Mueller's eyes lingered on Jenkins for a moment longer before he turned, slipping back into the shadows of his own trench. Jenkins watched him go, his heart heavy with the understanding that the fragile peace they had shared was now coming to an end. They were soldiers again, no longer men who had found common ground, but warriors who had been taught to hate each other, to fight until the end. But something had changed. Jenkins felt it deep within, a seed of doubt planted in the fertile soil of his conscience. It was small, yet undeniable, a persistent whisper that questioned the very nature of the conflict that pitted him against Mueller and countless others. He knew that Mueller would carry a similar burden, a shared dissonance that might never be fully reconciled. As he made his way back to the trench, Jenkins pondered what lay ahead. The war would continue, relentless in its demand for sacrifice and valor. Orders would be followed, battles would be fought, and lives would be lost. Yet, he carried with him a newfound hope that perhaps, someday, the world could be different, a world where such moments of connection would not be so rare, where understanding and empathy would not be drowned out by the cacophony of war. In the days that followed, Jenkins found himself looking for Mueller across the battlefield, searching for the familiar face among the chaos. He hoped, silently and fervently, that they would both survive to see the war's end, to return to lives where they could choose peace over conflict, friendship over enmity, Jenkins' thoughts were interrupted by the call to arms, a reminder of the brutal reality that lay ahead. But as he rushed to his post, he carried the memory of that brief encounter with him, a talisman against the bitterness and hatred that sought to consume him. In a world shrouded by darkness, the glimmer of human connection was a precious light, and Jenkins vowed to keep it alive, no matter how dim it might become. As each soldier turned to retreat to the safety of their lines, there was a brief, unspoken moment of hesitation. The reality of war loomed ahead, but so did the memory of what they had just experienced. The world felt smaller, bound together by invisible threads of shared experiences. They had met in the middle of a battlefield, if only for a few precious hours, and in that time they had found something more than the brutality of war. The sun sank lower in the sky, casting the battlefield in a golden hue. Its light now stretched across the scarred land. The soldiers walked back to their trenches, their movements slower now, as if the weight of the moment had taken something from them. The war would continue, the violence would return, but the memory of the day of shared laughter, of the simple act of offering a cup of tea, of playing a game of football with men who had been enemies just hours before, would stay with them. Back in the trenches, the soldiers resumed their roles, slipping into the routines they knew all too well. The hum of tension returned to the air, a steady undercurrent that was impossible to ignore. They knew what lay ahead. They knew the violence would resume, that the war would not be over with the setting of the Sunday, but the memory of the day, the bond they had shared, lingered like a whisper in their minds. Jenkins found himself standing at the edge of his trench, staring into the distance, the memory of the day pressing in on him. He had witnessed something remarkable, something he would never forget. The simple act of sharing tea with an enemy had opened his eyes to the possibility of peace, to the possibility that, even in the darkest of times, there was still humanity. He couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted within him, that the world he had known, the world of war, had been cracked open for just a moment, revealing something different, something worth holding on to. His hand tightened around his rifle, the familiar weight grounding him in the present. The sounds of gunfire in the distance reminded him of the reality he was still trapped in. He wasn't free from the war, not by any means, but as the light dimmed and the stars began to appear in the sky above, Jenkins allowed himself to hold on to the fragile hope that the world could one day change. Perhaps not today, perhaps not in his lifetime, but the thought lingered like a quiet promise that someday humanity would find a way to bridge the gap, to cross the divide that separated them. Do you think it'll ever end? Harris's voice broke into Jenkins's thoughts, quiet but full of the same weight that pressed on him. Jenkins turned to face his comrade, his friend, and the question seemed to hang between them. The simple answer was no. The war would not end any time soon. There would be more fighting, more lives lost. But in that moment, Jenkins couldn't help but feel a flicker of something hope, perhaps. It was weak, like a candle struggling to stay alight in the wind, but it was there, and that was something. "I hope so," Jenkins said, his voice barely above a whisper, but there was a conviction in it that surprised him. "I hope so, Harris." Harris nodded, but there was little hope in his eyes. He had seen too much, lost too much, to truly believe in the possibility of an end. But for now, they could only hold on to what they had. And what they had, fleeting as it was, had made the world feel a little less dark. The stars above shimmered in the cold night sky, indifferent to the small, fragile moments that had unfolded beneath them. The soldiers settled into their positions, their eyes weary but alert. Jenkins took his post, looking out across the field, his thoughts still heavy with what had happened. It had been a day unlike any other, a day that would stay with him for the rest of his life. And though he knew the war would continue, he also knew that something had shifted inside him, a small change, but one that felt like a flicker of light in the darkest of times. And as he watched the night unfold, as the wind whispered through the empty spaces of the battlefield, Jenkins held onto the memory of the day. The shared moments of peace, the quiet understanding between soldiers who had once been enemies, and the quiet hope that, perhaps, there would come a day when the world was no longer divided by the violence of war. For now, it was enough to hold on to that hope, to remember that even in the face of conflict, there was always the possibility of something better, something more. As the final notes of the day faded into the night, Jenkins closed his eyes for a moment and whispered to himself, "We'll never forget. We'll never forget." The next day, the war resumed. It came with the same relentless intensity that had defined the soldiers' lives for months. The battle raged on artillery shells screaming through the sky, rifles cracking in the distance, the ever-present cacophony of violence and chaos. But for the men who had shared that one night of peace, the world would never be quite the same. They had seen each other not as enemies, but as human beings. And in that fleeting moment, something had shifted in them, something deep and irreversibly changing. That shared experience, those small acts of kindness and understanding, could never be erased, no matter how much the war tried to drown them out. The sun rose the next morning, casting a soft golden hue over the battlefield, a stark contrast to the devastation that lay beneath it. The air was crisp, colder than it had been the night before, and the soldiers, now back in their uniforms, slowly began to stir from their makeshift camps. The trenches, once again, filled with men who had been stripped of their identities as individuals, now defined only by the colors of their uniforms and the insignia on their sleeves. But something subtle had changed in the way they looked at one another. There was a slight hesitation in their eyes as they passed one another, a flicker of recognition, as though they saw not an enemy but a fellow man. Jenkins, standing at the edge of his trench, adjusted his rifle and looked across the field. The war was still there, the same brutal and unforgiving war. Yet, in his chest, there was a quiet stir, a memory of the night before, of shared laughter, of a game of football, of tea passed between strangers who had, for a few hours, forgotten that they were supposed to be enemies. The memory felt too fragile, too out of place in the world that had now closed around him again. Yet it was there, like a quiet echo in his mind, one that wouldn't easily fade away. He turned to Harris, who was standing nearby, eyes scanning the horizon, as if preparing for the inevitable. "You think this will ever end?" Jenkins asked, his voice thick with the weight of the question. His words hung in the air for a moment, unanswered. They both knew the answer, of course. The war would end only when it did, whenever that was. But they also knew that no matter how long it took, there would always be something different in the way they looked at the men on the other side. Harris didn't answer immediately. He shifted his rifle slightly and looked down at the ground, the weight of his thoughts obvious. "I don't know, Sarge," he said finally. "But maybe, just maybe, when it's all over, people won't forget." Jenkins nodded, but his eyes were distant. He wasn't sure if the soldiers across the field would ever truly forget. After all, the memory of what had happened, the shared moments of peace, of humanity in the midst of war, had the potential to change everything. But for now, it was just a memory, and memories, no matter how powerful, were not enough to end a war. The commanders, oblivious to the small acts of kindness that had bloomed between the soldiers, moved around the battlefield, barking orders, urging the men to push forward, to advance, to take the land that had already been soaked in enough blood. Their voices were sharp, commanding, as they drove their troops back into the battle, unaware of the silent camaraderie that had blossomed in the trenches the night before. To them, the soldiers were nothing more than tools to achieve their goals, mere pawns in a larger game that had no room for empathy. As the soldiers moved forward, their rifles once again at the ready, there were moments of hesitation. A glance across the battlefield would reveal a familiar face, a soldier from the other side, perhaps one they had shared a cigarette with, or laughed with, or even played football against. For a split second, their eyes would meet, and the unspoken understanding would pass between them. But then, just as quickly, the noise of battle would drown it out. A shout, a command, the explosion of a shell, these things returned them to the reality of war, where everything was fleeting and peace was a luxury few could afford. But there were small acts of defiance. Soldiers, in the quiet moments between skirmishes, would pull out scraps of paper and pens, writing letters to loved ones back home. The words were carefully chosen, sometimes trembling with emotion, but more often than not, they carried an unusual tone, a tone that was different from the usual reports of battles won and lost. These letters spoke of more than just the hardships of war. They spoke of moments of peace, of brief encounters with humanity that had made them question everything they had been taught to believe. The soldiers wrote of the night under the stars when enemies had become friends, even if just for a few hours. They spoke of laughter, of stories shared, of a game of football on a battlefield that should have been nothing but death. There were no grand promises in these letters, no assurances that the war would end soon. But there was something quieter, something more profound hope that one day peace would prevail, not just in fleeting moments like this one, but in an enduring harmony between people who had learned, however briefly, to see each other as more than just enemies. These letters, though written in the shadow of violence, carried a message of humanity, a recognition that the war could not strip them of everything that made them who they were. As the days passed, the war continued. The sounds of battle became familiar again, the gunfire, the explosions, the cries of the wounded. But for those who had shared that one night of peace, the echoes of that day lingered like a quiet whisper. The soldiers who had met in the middle of the battlefield and shared something simple, something profoundly human, carried that memory with them into every new fight. They still wore their uniforms, still obeyed the orders, still fought the battles that were laid out for them, but they carried with them something that could never be taken away. The understanding that beneath the layers of uniform and insignia, beneath the words of the commanders and the mission objectives, they were all just men. They were human. The commanders might not have seen it, might not have understood the subtle shift in the hearts of their men, but the soldiers knew. They knew that every charge, every skirmish, was now tinged with the memory of shared stories and laughter, of a night when differences were set aside, if only for a little while. And in those moments, when their eyes met across the battlefield, when the noise of war faded just enough for them to recognize each other as something more than enemies, they carried the seed of something else, a possibility that maybe, one day, war wouldn't be the answer. As Jenkins stood on the edge of the trench, Watching the movement of men across the field, he couldn't help but wonder about the future. Would this war ever end? Would he ever get the chance to return home, to live a life untouched by the brutality he had seen? The thought was distant, far-fetched even, but in the silence of the battlefield, amidst the chaos and destruction, the possibility lingered, fragile and faint, like the first breath of spring after a long, bitter winter. The days passed, and the war continued, each day blending into the next. But for Jenkins and the others, something had changed. They no longer saw the enemy as just that an enemy. They saw him as a man, with his own struggles, his own fears, his own hopes. They had shared that night of peace, that rare moment of connection, and no matter how hard the war raged around them, no matter how deep the trenches became, that connection could never be erased. The soldiers returned to their posts, their eyes a little heavier, their hearts a little fuller. And though the war would continue, though the battle would rage on, there was something new in the way they held their rifles, something new in the way they moved. They had seen each other, not as enemies, but as human beings, and that was something that could never be undone. As Jenkins returned to his watch, he looked out across the battlefield, his mind still drifting to that brief, unexpected moment of peace. Maybe it was nothing more than a fleeting dream, a momentary lapse in the violence. But for him, for all of them, it was a reminder, however small, however fragile, that peace could exist, even in the heart of war. And that, in itself, was something worth fighting for. The final shots echoed across the battlefield, the sound sharp and hollow, hanging in the cold air like the last gasp of something once fierce, now fading. Jenkins stood motionless, watching the smoke rise from the distance, his rifle loosely held in his hands. The weight of the day, the violence, the chaos still hung on him, thick and heavy. Yet something else had begun to stir beneath it. The sound of the shots faded. The ground beneath them seemed to settle, and for a brief moment, everything went quiet. It was then that Jenkins turned to Harris, who had been standing silently beside him, his eyes distant, his thoughts clearly far away. "You ever think?" Jenkins began, his voice low, almost uncertain. He looked over at Harris, the weight of his question heavy. "Maybe we're more than just soldiers?" Harris didn't answer immediately. He stared out across the battlefield, where the last of the fighting was slowly coming to a halt, and for a long time, Jenkins wasn't sure if he was even going to respond. But then, slowly, Harris nodded, his face unreadable, his eyes distant, but full of something deeper than the fatigue that had marked him. "Yeah," Harris finally said, his voice soft but resolute. "Yeah, I think we are." It was a simple answer, yet it carried with it the weight of something profound. Jenkins didn't know if they were more than just soldiers. Not really, not yet, but in that moment, in the shared silence between them, something flickered in his chest, something like hope. The world had taught them both to be soldiers, to fight, to survive. But standing there, in the midst of the aftermath of war, with the echoes of the violence fading into the air, Jenkins felt a subtle shift inside him. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't just a soldier, he was a man, and so was Harris. They had fought, yes, but they had also shared something that made them realize they were more than the roles they had been forced to play. And in that quiet exchange, the understanding passed between them like an unspoken vow. Despite the war, despite the darkness that surrounded them, They were more than just soldiers. They were human beings, with the capacity for peace, for connection, even in the most unlikely of places. The conversation hung in the air, its silence stretching between them like a thread of something fragile, yet strong. As the last traces of battle died down, Jenkins and Harris stood side by side, their bodies a little heavier, their hearts a little lighter. The shared experience of the day bonding them in ways words could not quite capture. The battlefield, once a place of chaos and noise, now felt strangely still, as though it, too, was taking a deep, weary breath. Above them, the sky, once heavy with smoke and the violence of war, began to clear. The clouds parted, and through the space between them, the stars began to emerge, twinkling like a promise, a flicker of hope that could not be extinguished. They stood there for a moment longer, letting the quiet wash over them. The world had been irrevocably changed, not just by the violence of the battle, but by something simpler, something that transcended everything else, the shared humanity that had bloomed in the middle of it all. For Jenkins, the battlefield felt smaller now, as if it had contracted, shaped not by the violence of war, but by the fleeting moments of connection they had all shared. "Come on," Harris said, breaking the silence, his voice slightly more strained now, but there was something hopeful in it. "Let's get back to camp." Jenkins nodded, still lost in the quiet, but he fell in step beside his friend, their boots crunching in the dirt as they made their way back to camp. The familiar sounds of their comrades' laughter, voices grew louder as they neared, the rhythm of life resuming its place among the soldiers. The camp, with its makeshift tents and fires, felt a world away from the battlefield they had just left behind. It was still a war zone, of course, but for the briefest of moments, it felt almost like a home. It felt like life. Back at camp, Jenkins and Harris were greeted by the sight of their fellow soldiers, their faces worn but relieved, their movements less stiff now, as if the weight of the day's violence had been lifted, even if just temporarily. The warmth of a shared meal, the comfort of being surrounded by their comrades, provided an anchor amidst the uncertainty of war. The men spoke of their families, of the places they came from, of the lives they dreamed of returning to when it was all over. And though they had all shared in the same brutal experience, the conversations had changed since that night in no man's land. There was a new, unspoken understanding among them, something more than the usual shared hardship. Jenkins took a seat near a fire, staring into the dancing flames, his thoughts still lingering on the fleeting moments of peace. He felt a shift in himself, a subtle change he couldn't quite explain. It was something that had been quietly planted the night before, nurtured by the unexpected camaraderie, the simple exchange of kindness, and the understanding that they were not so different after all. The shared moments of laughter, the tea, the game of football, they hadn't just been distractions, they had been revelations. They had shown him and the others that humanity could still exist, even in the darkest of times, that peace, though fleeting, could be possible. Harris sat beside him, the weight of the day hanging in the air, but his shoulders were a little less burdened now. Do you think we can ever get back to something like that?" Harris asked, his voice tentative, as though he was unsure whether to hope or not. Jenkins didn't answer right away. His gaze drifted from the fire to the soldiers around them, each one lost in his own thoughts, each one carrying with him the same mixture of hope and uncertainty. "I don't know," Jenkins said after a moment, his voice thick with emotion, "but I know that it's worth hoping for. And maybe it starts with us." Harris nodded, a slight smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Maybe, he murmured. The night deepened around them, the sky now a dark velvet canvas scattered with stars. The fire crackled, the warmth of it enveloping them. And for the first time in a long while, Jenkins felt something he hadn't felt in years, a sense of peace. However fragile, however brief, it was a fleeting feeling, but it was there, and it was enough to remind him that the human spirit could endure even the harshest of conditions. As the night wore on, the soldiers continued to talk, their voices growing quieter as fatigue set in. They spoke of their families, of dreams of home, of the lives they longed to return to when the war was over. Each story, each memory, was a testament to their resilience, a reminder of who they were before the war had stolen so much from them. They were still people, still human, capable of love, of kindness, of joy. And that, Jenkins realized, was what mattered most. It wasn't the uniforms they wore, the battles they fought, or the medals they earned. It was the humanity they carried with them, the capacity for peace, for empathy, even in the worst of times. As the fire burned low, Jenkins and Harris exchanged a final, knowing glance. They didn't need words anymore. The night had done its work. In the quiet between them, they both understood that what they had shared was something rare, something precious. And though the war would continue, though the battles would rage on, they knew they had witnessed something that could never be erased. The undeniable power of human connection, even in the darkest hours. Together, they made a silent vow. They would carry this truth with them as best they could through the remainder of the war. They would remember the night of peace, the night when enemies had become friends, and hold on to the hope that someday, somehow, peace could be more than a fleeting dream. It could be a reality. For now, it wasn't just about surviving another day, it was about living with purpose, with compassion, and with the unwavering belief that peace, no matter how fleeting, was worth fighting for. And that's where we leave things for now. What a journey it's been, right? From the chaos of war to the brief, beautiful moments of peace. We've seen how even the most unlikely friendships can be forged in the heat of conflict. What I hope you take away from this story is the reminder that no matter how dark the world may seem, we all have the capacity for empathy, kindness, and understanding. And sometimes it's in the smallest gestures, sharing a cup of tea, playing a game, even just listening, that we find the most powerful connections. If this story moved you, or if you feel that same hope for peace, I'd love to hear from you. What do you think? Can true peace ever be possible, even in the midst of war? Do you believe that, just like these soldiers, we can find common ground when everything seems divided? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I'd really love to hear your perspective. And hey, if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Sharing these kinds of stories helps spread that spark of empathy and connection. So, if you think someone else could use a reminder of our shared humanity, send this their way. Let's keep the conversation going and share these moments of light. It's easy to forget, but we have to keep remembering, right? The world could use more of that. Thanks for being a part of this. I can't wait to bring you more stories, more journeys that challenge us to think about who we are and who we want to be. Until next time, stay kind, stay hopeful, and keep fighting for peace however you can. See you in the next episode.